There's this amazing watercolor technique that I feel like we don't talk enough about because all the classes and tutorials are typically focused on either wet on dry or wet on wet watercolor techniques, but there's this amazing thing in between that can help you produce some really cool results, especially if you're into botanical art. It's called wet on damp, meaning it's not quite the typical wet on wet that you may be used to, where you wet the paper first and then let the colors flow in different directions, and it's not wet on dry, meaning you have a little bit less control. So it's that very specific time that you have to catch right before your paper is completely dry, and you can introduce a little bit of saturated pigment to create some really gorgeous effects and capture natural, realistic looking details. And in this tutorial I'm going to show you how you can apply it in your practice using this painting of blue orchids, and we're going to go through it step by step. I'm going to give you some useful tips that I've learned over the years and a full real-time version of this tutorial, which is several hours long, with outlines and additional commentary will be posted on my Patreon channel this month. So here's my sketch, and I will start by wetting the petal with clear water. Drop some yellow ochre in the center and then some blue around the edges. This is classic wet on wet technique. Any pigment I add from now on will spread gently for as long as my paper is wet. And you can introduce additional pigments like purples or violets while everything is still wet and drying. I will apply the same wet on wet technique up on top and then on the left. Now a few minutes have passed and my paper is much more dry, so when I add more color, it's not going to spread very far, which means we can try what's called wet on damp technique. So I will grab some very thick saturated phthalo blue and start slowly applying thin lines with just the tip of my brush. At first, as you can see, the lines are spreading and almost disappearing into the paper. Just a minute later, I will do the same thing using ultramarine, and the lines now stay in place a bit better. And one more time, a minute later, using purple, now the lines are even sharper. But they still spread just a little bit, creating a softer look. And the reason why I use different colors is just to show you some variation. You can continue with the same pigment. Now take a look in contrast. If I work on a dry petal that we just painted a few minutes ago, about 10 minutes in real time, it's dry now, and you can see the lines that I'm applying are very crisp. And even though the result is similar, it's slightly less realistic because we can see my strokes. It loses just a little bit of that softness that we can observe in the reference photo. The petals of the real orchid are quite thick and full of water, and so the lines there are much softer compared to what I'm able to create using wet on dry technique. So you may be thinking, okay, this is a bit too much, trying to juggle wet on wet timing, dropping colors, then trying to get thin lines immediately after. And the good news is that you can definitely separate the two steps, the wet on dry and wet on damp, and make it much more manageable. So here, as you can see, I painted the rest of the petals using wet on wet technique, and I allowed them to dry for about 15 minutes. Now I'm going to return to this petal. It's completely dry now. I will cover it just with clear water all over, making sure that it's not super wet, like it's not dripping off the page, just enough to make it slightly damp. Then I'm going to grab some very saturated phthalo blue. Mine is from Core by Golden, and I will draw some thin lines just with the tip of my brush. And the nice thing is that we're not losing that first layer of color that's still visible. We're just adding more saturated, fainted lines on top of what's already there. Similarly, on this central segment of the flower, I will paint with clear water first on top of the layer that I've painted using wet on wet technique. It's completely dry now. And then I will use phthalo blue to add the lines, and my tip here is to continue adding more and more saturated color in the same spot. So you can paint over the same line several times, refreshing the pigment on the tip of your brush until the surface is dry. and you can double down on those lines, adding stroke after stroke, refreshing the paint, and each additional line you paint will look a little bit sharper, a little bit darker, and it will spread less and less until they stop spreading completely and you can stop working on this layer. A couple of more tips and tricks that you can add as you get more comfortable with this technique and start incorporating it in your work. So first of all, as you can see now, we're not limited to one color. You can use 2 or 3, just dipping the tip of your brush into different paint wells to add some variation. I went with phthalo blue, green shade and red shade. I used some dioxazine purple. You can try quinacridone violet or even magenta for a warmer effect. And by warmer, I mean closer to the red side of the spectrum. I did use a little bit of ultramarine, but it is tricky because it's granulating, and so it will add additional detail to some of your strokes. I prefer, for this wet on damp effect, using primarily transparent, non-granulating staining colors because they appear sharper and there's no granulation that can potentially muddy up the overall effect. In terms of the brush shapes that work best, I would say any good round brush with a sharp tip will work for this technique, but some shapes add additional flexibility and may work particularly well for different subjects. For example, you may find that so-called rigger brushes, these really long brushes that you can find in the art store, they're longer than average round brushes. They work best for more elongated organic lines, and you can see me using a Kronos rigger brush here from Escoda. It's very thin, it's extra long, as any rigger should be, and this added length is what compensates for any potential wobbliness you may encounter. So for longer lines, try a rigger brush. It also works really well for hair strokes and, as you can imagine, some long waves on the water that you can use the wet on damp technique for. On the other hand, you may find extra short, smaller brushes will give you more stability and work better for smaller strokes. So here, for example, I'm using the same Kronos brush, but it's not a rigger. It's a 00, barely enough hair to pick up a tiny amount of paint, but I feel a lot more confident using it on shorter strokes and edges where I need to be more precise. And you also have the added benefit of not loading too much water on this brush because there's not a lot of hair. So there's less of a chance of having an accident by accidentally pressing too hard, spilling too much water, and having your pigment spread too far. The downside, of course, is that you will need to dip this kind of brush into paint a lot more frequently, but I don't mind. Now back to my regular round brush, you can tell the lines are now a little bit thicker, and for the initial wet on wet wash, of course, you want to use your regular round brush. Size 3 and 4 are my favorite for this type of work. I typically work on 7x9 or 9x12, 12x12 size of paper. It's just big enough to hold enough water and pigment when you paint larger segments, and the tip is sharp enough to be used for thinner lines. So this particular brush I've been using since last April, about 10 months now, and because it's made with 90% synthetic, it lasts a long time even with frequent use, and it's rather affordable compared to natural brushes that I used to favor. But that 10% of natural fur does give it enough flexibility and water load and makes it comparable to natural brushes. So I've been very happy to use these Kronos brushes from Escoda and very confident recommending them, and I'll leave a link in the video description below. Another tip for wet on damp technique is that it's much easier to practice on a bigger size. So if you increase your paper size and make these elements bigger, less intricate, it's much easier to get used to this technique and get more comfortable with the timing, because we only have a short period of time in between the wet paper and the damp paper that very quickly becomes dry. So when you go bigger, that period is extended and your paper stays damp a lot longer, allowing you to create more detail. I've done a full tutorial using this technique on much larger flowers, so stargazer lilies. As you can see, the lines are a lot thicker. You can find this tutorial here on YouTube and also in real time on my Patreon. And if you want to practice the very basics and learn more about the timing of wet on wet and wet on damp techniques in general, understand your paper capabilities a lot more, I have a pretty useful exercise that I also recorded for YouTube that you can check out right after this video. What I need to do next is add a small element that complements the flowers, and I asked my followers on Instagram and Facebook to send me their recommendations. It appears that most of you want to see a dragonfly next to the orchids because I already have butterfly tutorials and hummingbird tutorials, so that's what I'm going to add next. Something very delicate and subtle, not to take away from the beauty of these flowers. So I hope you found these tips interesting. It's a tricky technique, but it can really enrich your work if you do this right, if you test and experiment. And I do encourage you to go for full 100% cotton paper and have some fun with your paints. Maybe try different brushes that you haven't tried before. It's a really fun technique to experiment with. Try it on your botanicals, try it on seascapes, and let me know in comments below how you like it. Don't forget to subscribe if you're new to this channel, and I really appreciate all your shares, comments, and likes. You can tag me on Instagram if you do your own version, and I will see you next week with a fresh tutorial.